Hello, Overthinkers. I'm so delighted to welcome to our channel today Eli Burnstein, who now has a brand new book. I'm going to bring it actually up to the camera to show you, called A Dictionary of Fine Distinctions. And I'm going to be talking to Eli today about this book. So Eli, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Your trajectory, we'll get into your career trajectory a little bit later, because you started as a philosopher and then transitioned into full-time writer with an emphasis on humor.
I went rogue.
You did go rogue. And so I want to come back to that a little bit later. But of course, at first I want to just talk about the book because, this book called Dictionary of Fine Distinctions is about fine distinctions. Okay, I'm going to shut up, actually. You tell us about your book.
Sure. As the title suggests, it is about fine distinctions. It is a collection of fine distinctions. Now, as for what qualifies as a fine distinction, basically, to me, it was anything that we're either liable to get confused about or that we don't even realize is a distinction in the first place. So, to take an example from the first category, although it will be subjective, Great Britain versus United Kingdom. A lot of people in North America know there's a difference, but we tend to muddle it up. I'm speaking broadly, right? Taking an example from the second class, you could say ethics and morality. I personally didn't even realize there was a distinction until I started looking into it, and lo and behold, there is a subtle difference.
Which is funny, because that's precisely the distinction that I want to come back to later, because it's one that is very close to our hearts as philosophers.
Yeah. And let me just add one more thing too, that's the premise of the book. In terms of subject matter, it goes all over the place, and it is not organized by theme or alphabetically. It's kind of meant to be diverse, eclectic, and just a kind of discovering experience. Best of all, it's illustrated.
Yes, absolutely. Leggings versus tights was one that I remember.
Versus stockings versus pantyhose.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Symphony versus concerto is one I'm coming across here. So I want to ask you, so actually we'll share first the subtitle of the book, because I feel like that gives a little bit of a sense too of what you're talking about. So it's Dictionary of Fine Distinctions, Nuances, Niceties, and Subtle Shades of Meaning, an assorted synonymy. Sorry, I'm reading this to you as if you don't know it.
This is perfect.
An assorted synonymy and encyclopedia of commonly confused objects, ideas, and words, distinguished with the aid of illustrations. And I think, taking a look at this book for me is a soothing experience, because as a philosopher, I love parsing distinctions. It brings me joy and a sense of clarity to be able to identify the difference, whether it's between pantyhose and stockings, or ethics and morality, or a concerto versus symphony. Especially in the latter case, you have to figure out when to clap, when's the appropriate time to clap. And so I do think, that kind of signals that these distinctions, at least in my mind, it's not just fun wordplay. I mean, this is a very humorous book. You've written for McSweeney's and The New Yorker and are very comfortable in this humor space. But it also, has real world implications to distinguish these things. So I want to read something from the introduction, foreword, or preface, which I think you end up saying is a preface, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. So what's the difference between introduction, foreword, and preface? You can read this to find out. But one of the things that you say here is that when we put life under the microscope in this way, the result is crisp, sparkling clarity. But you also note that the real world is a very messy place, and the way that we use language is often changing over time in different contexts. And so I'm wondering how you sort of think about negotiating, on the one hand, the messy reality that often exceeds the discursive or the words that we attach to things, and on the other hand, this crisp, sparkling clarity that we can get from distinctions.
It's a great question. The short answer is with great difficulty.
Okay.
But you said a couple things that I really want to unpack. So one, I'm so glad that you picked up on, and so glad and not surprised that you picked up on kind of the quasi-philosophical aspect of it, and not just the linguistic component, right?
Yeah.
So, I've spoken to a lot of people, and they say, hey, I'm a big word nerd. I love this, and it always bothers me when people get this wrong or when they screw that up, and I'm so glad you're setting the record straight. And there are things to talk about on that side of the spectrum, but you picking up on the kind of philosophical satisfaction of just teasing apart a difference, of really getting to the essence of what makes two things logically relate to one another, where they mutually exclude one another. It kind of, your inner logician, it really kind of, for me, it really kind of tickled that part of my brain.
Okay.
And so, I mean, there are other philosophical things to pick up on this, or to perhaps kind of eke out of the book as well. But to me, that was a very fun part of the writing process. Although also sometimes, to go back to your real question, a frustrating experience. So to answer your question is, how do I square the kind of messiness of the world with the kind of the goal I've set for myself of linguistic clarity? Yeah, I mean, it was frustrating. Every entry was its own little odyssey. So, it would often start by consulting dictionaries, naturally, seeing what, how two similar words would be defined, and then seeing where they kind of mutually exclude one another. But then, bringing out my inner empiricist would also have to look at how these words are used in the world. So starting with sample sentences, provided often generously by dictionaries, but then going to what are called English language corpora, these vast banks of text. Where I
want to check these out. I didn't know about these.
So the lexicographers use these constantly to, when they're writing their definitions, to see, okay, well, I can't just impose my understanding of the definition of the word on the world. I do have to at least look out and see how people are using the word, right? So you look, and look, I am not a lexicographer. I'm not a trained lexicographer. This is fun amateur work, but ultimately you do have to kind of see how these words are being used, and then of course, so there's the dictionaries, there's usage manuals, usage experts, where people will have often weighed in on certainly the more grammatical definitions, and then there was a little bit of neurotic field research where I would go into grocery stores and look at the ingredients lists of like club soda and sparkling water. And what is the difference? But yeah, and then really just a lot of banging my head against a wall and kind of just, what it's like to write a philosophy paper. You're like, well, how do these things relate? And you're just moving text around on the page and ideas around in your head until suddenly it all clicks into place. And you're like, yeah, I think I've got it. And I kind of just, I mean, the goal was to be pretty succinct or concise with each one. What's the difference between succinct and concise? But trying to be. Is
that one of the ones?
No, it's not.
I don't think
volume two. But yeah, I was trying to be concise, but ultimately that was the experience. Each one was just trying to kind of get to good enough in terms of have I got to the core of the difference.
Yeah, and I think that process of research that you're describing, even though it's using things that I've never heard of, like these, what was the thing?
Well, English language corpus is singular, corpora, plural. Of course, it's got to be a fancy plural.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But even though you're using those kinds of things that maybe linguists or people in different disciplines would be using, rather than, like, I haven't heard of philosophers using those types of things, I think this process of research you're describing is very philosophical. And I think you do see sort of traditional philosophical works also grappling with these words' meanings in different ways. You can think about how Heidegger uses etymology to go back to the roots of different words. That's something that I've done in my recent work on sexual consent, thinking about how, even though we tend to think about consent as a sort of contractual type of thing, and in our society, that word very much has contractual connotations. When you go back to the Latin origin, it comes from to feel with. And so my most recent publication on this is, I think it's my only peer-reviewed publication on sexual consent. So I should say that this 2022 article that I wrote on phenomenology and sexual consent is really built on this idea that there's something in the word origin that we can use. But of course, it's not enough just to be like, this is the Latin root, let's completely decontextualize it, make some new meaning of it, and see what happens. But that's part of the process. Or you might think as well about ordinary language philosophers who are, I don't know that they're necessarily empirically surveying how people are using the words in, vast swaths of the population, but they often are like drawing on how people are using these terms in everyday language. And that's like one thing I've gotten pushback on about my work on consent is that people are like, oh, cool, you're going back to the Latin origin. But that's not really how people are using consent today. And that's a philosophical debate that we're having at conferences.
That's great. I mean, again, so much to unpack in that. I think with the ordinary language philosophers, if I recall, I loved them, and I agree. Maybe they weren't rigorous empiricists in their own right, but I do think they were setting some philosophical groundwork to do that kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's possible lexicographers were doing it already, so we don't need your theoretical framework. Thank you very much. But contra, if I recall, folks like Bertrand Russell and the generation before who were very abstract about language, the ordinary language philosophers, were like, words derive their meaning from how they're used, right? So how people are using them in everyday life, let's not get super abstract about propositions and logical relationships and all that. It's just how do people use the words? And so I think it is very much about going back to how people use it. But I think etymology too is another super valuable tactic. I think you're right to flag that it's not the be all end all. And there's got to be some good term for like an etymological fallacy where you go, you look at the etymology and then you say, well, if that's, if we break down the Latin origin, then it must mean that Latin origin. It's like, well, no, there's been, needless to say, tons of shifting. Lots of words don't mean what they used to mean. Yeah. But at the same time, it's evocative. And I think it's a great technique to say, okay, well, maybe this doesn't say exactly what it means, but it's an avenue, right? It's a way to think about it, and I think that can help you on your way to find the answer. So again, maybe we'll get to ethics and morality a third time, but even in that context, so ethics comes from the Greek, morality comes from Latin. It's probably not surprising then that in philosophy classes we teach ethics. We don't teach morality, right? Yeah. So right, the Greeks famously much more theoretically inclined than the Romans, who were very applied. The Greeks had the mathematicians and the Romans had the engineers, as the story goes. And I don't know why I keep doing air quotes. We'll edit that out.
It's just your thing.
Yeah, edit that out in post. But and I think relatedly, ethics has a more again, it's a fine distinction even by the standards of the book, but it has a much more conceptual flavor or cerebral connotation, whereas morality evokes more something of a matter of the heart or of the conscience, right? So sample phrases. This is a great way to kind of drive home the point, or I hope it's a great way, is with ethics we often talk about workplace ethics, professional ethics, philosophical, ethical theories. But morality, we'll talk about moral fiber, moral compass. So again, when you're talking about, it's not a sharp difference, or it's not a hard difference, I should say, but ethics tends to imply more explicit principles of right and wrong, intelligible principles of right and wrong, whereas morality is right and wrong more as a felt sense.
Which is so interesting, because I feel like philosophers often use these two terms in very confused ways, sometimes even kind of with the opposite connotations of what you're talking about. So I want to dive more deeply into this ethics and morality distinction, because I think it's something that would be really helpful for those of us who are, working on ethics, as well as those who are just interested in it in their everyday lives. So, you have this this fun drawing. I'll just show again, going up to the camera to show some of these fun illustrations. So ethics refers to intelligible principles of right and wrong, whereas morality refers to right and wrong as a felt sense, sort of following up on what you just said. And so ethics in this case would be more rational and explicit, and morality would be more emotional and deep-seated. So tell us, just a bit more about like the Latin origins, the relative Greek and Latin origins of this, and sort of, you mentioned, a little bit about the history. Okay, sorry, we had to cut. My iPhone storage was out. We're recording this while traveling, and I didn't have enough storage. So after a detour, of offloading many apps and a video, I was asking you about the morality and ethics distinction and how knowing the distinction that you're drawing here based on those kinds of research that you've done, how does this shape how you think about these things in your daily life, if at all? And what do you think, what kind of implications might this have?
Yeah, big question. I mean, how I think about it, I suppose, as lovers of philosophy, I think part of clarity is that it's a joy in its own right. I mean, there's an inherent value to clarity. I think sharpening your grasp on the distinctions between these things, I think, helps you. Again, it tickles that part of your brain. I think it also gives you a more vivid grasp on the nuances of the world. I mean, perhaps only for a moment, then we go back to forgetting about it and living our lives. But as the subtitles suggest, nuances, niceties, and subtle shades of meaning. I think it's about kind of keying in a more granular level to these little differences that are absolutely everywhere that we can't focus on in our day-to-day lives because we have to go about our business, but they're absolutely everywhere. Like ethics and morality, the fact that we have two words to track such a slight difference, and that we're not aware of it consciously, but I think that we don't need to be conscious of it for these words to still resonate differently when we hear them, right? We don't need to have a conscious awareness of that. It just, when somebody says that's unethical versus that's immoral, it hits different. It hits a little different, and lots of overlap, of course, but and that slight difference just can take the conversation in a different way, can take your thoughts in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think, if you're writing, picking the best word or the most accurate word, not best, but the most apt word for what it is you're trying to describe, I think just keys the reader in that much more to the thing that you're trying to describe, right? It gets them that much closer to reality.
Yeah.
Not to bring up all these epistemological questions about, exactly. Yeah. Is there reality? Are we corresponding? Whatever. But I still think, let's say that is the correct model of reality. Then yes, it can bring you closer to it. It makes it more vivid. I mean, that's great writers often have a really, intuitive and well-honed sense of the right word, right? And they're laying one good word after another, and it just brings you so close to what's being described, whether it's fiction and storytelling or nonfiction and kind of argument making.
Definitely. And I think when we're talking about ethics and morality in particular, I alluded earlier to the fact that I feel like this is somewhat different from how I sometimes hear philosophers describe these. Because one thing I've heard, and I don't know if this has any evidence or it's just some kind of folklore I picked up in grad school, is that ethics has more to do with the everyday norms that we live under that are often implicit, actually, and that morality has to do more with laws and rules, which seems precisely the opposite of what you're saying. It does. And I'm wondering if the reason that I've kind of picked up that distinction, which is a bit opposed to what you're describing here, is because of the legacy of German philosophy, where there's the term Sittlichkeit, and then there's the term Moralität.
Right.
Moralität, and or Sittlichkeit. Sometimes my dad tells me when I do that, Sittlichkeit, I sound like I'm not speaking high enough German.
Right.
Anyway, okay, that's like a total sidebar. I feel like we could go on so many tangents. But anyway, so that Sittlichkeit is often what's translated as ethics into English, and that has to do more with ethical life. It's what's translated, often as ethical life in Hegel. And it's sort of before the formal laws that we get in Moralität. And then you also have the genealogy of morality in Nietzsche, for instance, where he's kind of tracing from, I would say, the felt sense that you're describing as morality to what you're describing as ethics, this more explicit distinction.
And does Nietzsche use the word moralität or
he does. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm on safe ground with Nietzsche then. But I mean, at first I was going to say, well, damn, you found such a strong counterexample.
No.
But I think your introduction of I think your suspicion that this comes from German sounds like a good one, and this rings a bell. I wish I remembered it as well as you do, but I remember Sittlichkeit, I remember Moralität a little bit, and it's just proof that this will be language dependent, right? So in German, each word's going to resonate in its own way differently, and we can't translate with the utmost literalness that Moralität and morality, in German and English respectively, are going to have the same resonance. They often might, but there is going to be a lot of shape shifting along the way, and I think that's what makes good translation work so, especially with philosophy, such a thorny practice.
Definitely. And the reason that I mentioned that distinction is because it's never, like I mentioned, I had sort of picked it up in the water from grad school. People mentioned it. It was part of when I was trying to decide whether to say that what I was doing was ethics or morality. It seemed like ethics was the way to go because that captured more of the messiness. But the way that distinction was drawn, I feel like was always a little bit fuzzy. And so I think what you're providing here with seeking this clarity, to go back to what you said earlier, just like there is this sense of release. And I think a little bit about John Dewey's account of thinking, where for Dewey, the process of thinking is really the process of grappling with confusion, and then it results in this kind of, okay, things have fallen into place. And I think that really is what is being offered by such distinctions. I also wonder how this comes up in everyday conversation with people, because as a philosopher, as somebody who likes precision, I can sometimes be that asshole in a conversation. It's like, I actually think you mean this other thing. And I think when we're among philosophers, those kinds of corrections are often taken as welcome. We're not offended by them. But in everyday life, at a dinner party, it's not really a comfortable situation to correct somebody on their use of a term. I have this one friend who always uses the term bamboozled when they mean confused. And I'm like, that's not what bamboozled means. Right. I think you need a distinction between bamboozled and confused.
Right.
So I wonder what you think, should we go around
I think you're
correcting
people?
yeah. Should we be correcting people? Should we be correcting ourselves?
Yeah. No. I don't. I mean, that it's a good question, and I want to say there's no good answer, or at least I don't have a good answer, because I think that you're right. Some people welcome it, others don't. Mm-hmm. Some people welcome it from some people,
yes.
Right? Like maybe from your teacher, maybe from a very good friend or a partner.
Oh, good point.
Who does, and then a third thing is the manner in which you correct someone also matters hugely. Are you being condescending, or are you being helpful? Do you know that the person wants help? There are so many unresolved questions. Fortunately, most contexts, the stakes are low. That if you kind of rankle someone for correcting them when they didn't want to, they'll probably forgive you. But I mean, I would err on the side of caution and not.
Yeah.
And if it really bugs you, just kind of keep it to yourself. But maybe if it's a good friend, you'd be like, I was like, oh, but if by bamboozled you mean confused, then blah, blah, blah. Like you can also weave a little. Humor is a great way to kind of blunt the edge of what it is you're trying to say. And kind of be a jerk about it, but in a hopefully lovable way.
I feel like that's not my personality.
Fair enough. And maybe I think I'm being charming, and my friends are like, that made it worse. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's a good question. Like I'm not going to correct my boss. Well, depends on the relationship, but in any case, it's a hard question.
Definitely. I want to ask you... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say, I think that this brings up... I think we were maybe talking earlier about, is the goal of the book to correct people? And
I think that might have been in the part that we
had this great discussion. No. You're right. We were starting to... Well, you were asking, how does these distinctions kind of affect how you think? And I think that maybe I was wanting to build off that and say, it makes me kind of savor these differences in life. So yes, there's the philosophical joy. Yes, there's that kind of being keyed into reality in this great way. And what I hope that what the goal of the book is for me is not to arm people with a corrective, or not to correct people or help them correct others, but to kind of foster that appreciation for the nuances that are everywhere, right?
Okay.
And I know that's a little hokey, but I just think life is just teeming with these subtle differences. Literally every object, every idea. So another example that's kind of my go-to, there's ethics and morality, and there's assume and presume, right? So to assume is to suppose something without not necessarily any evidence. Yeah. To presume is to suppose something with confidence. I'm bungling this right now. Let me start again.
Yeah.
To assume, let's consult the book. No, to assume is to suppose without strong evidence. To presume is to suppose with confidence, because there is going to be some evidence for your belief. So classic expression is presumed dead, missing, presumed dead. That's usually because there's a good reason, like lost at sea, missing, presumed dead. If someone's lost at sea, unfortunately, it's not very likely, but there's some likelihood that they're dead, right? So it's a lovely illustration by Liana Fink. We didn't talk about her either, but she's a wonderful illustrator, and I was really lucky to have her. But yeah, so thank you for finding it. To assume is to suppose without proof, and to presume is to do so with confidence or authority.
I mean, you got it right too. That was
more. The editor helped me make that less wordy, but yeah, and in the kind of fine print on that, I explained that presuming is confident because there's some inferential support for your belief. And so again, we don't consciously know this, but when we say assume or presume, or when we hear assume or presume, these kind of semantic fields of meaning come with the words and have an effect on us.
Yeah.
And again, guide us in different ways. And I think that is such a subtle difference, and language's ability to track these differences in every single word that we speak, and in a language as rich as with synonyms as English, it's mind-boggling to me that we're just there's hundreds of thousands of words to just track all these little, not just made up things, but these are human behaviors. Assuming is something that humans do, and presuming is something that humans do. And they're slightly different. Yeah. And we have words for each, and I think that that's awesome.
Yeah, it would be very strange to see assumed dead in a newspaper. And I almost feel like what it would track for me is it would feel callous.
Yeah,
and so
totally,
even though I didn't know the distinction before you mentioned it, I wonder if part of the reason it would feel callous, in addition to the fact that it just sounds wrong because that's not the way we use it, is because assuming doesn't have any evidence. And so there's this sense that, whoever's saying assumed dead didn't do any due diligence in trying to see whether this person is alive or not, right? I think that speaks to precisely what you're talking about, this way that there can be this subtle, subtle sense for us of the distinction, even if we don't know how to define it. And part of what I love about philosophy is it's often making assumptions explicit, and it sounds like this is exactly what you're doing here too.
Yeah, I definitely am trying to kind of bring to the surface things that in a way we already know, that we intuitively grasp when we read, as you say, these shades of meaning, right? So if somebody said, he's assumed dead, you'd be like, right? Yeah. But and you don't necessarily know why, or with time and unpacking, you can come to the conclusion why, but we don't know why in the moment, but it still has an effect on us. We feel why, and as lovers of theory and lovers of making things explicit, this is similar to kind of philosophical projects. Yeah,
which I want to dive into a little bit more deeply, but before we do that, what's the difference between club soda and sparkling water?
Oh yeah, that's the most philosophical difference of all. So sparkling water is naturally mineralized water that wells up out of springs. Okay. Right? So it, because of the spring out of which the water wells, the rocks, it will have kind of some minerals particles in the water, and that gives it a subtle flavor, extremely subtle, but I mean the book's all about subtlety, but very subtle flavor that makes it nicer. And in fact, some sparkling mineral water is actually naturally carbonated as well. So Perrier originally, it doesn't just come up mineralized. I said mineralated before, I think mineralized, but also naturally effervescent, believe it or not. These days, the early days of Perrier, that's how you drink it, but these days, international standards, whatnot, they actually decarbonate it and then recarbonate it so that it's consistent and to the level that they want and all that. Club soda, yes, sparkling water or sparkling mineral water is what I just described. Club soda is trying to imitate that. So club soda is water to which carbon dioxide has been manually added, and more important, to which mineral salts have been manually added. Right? So if you look on the back of any club soda can, it won't just say water, carbon dioxide. It'll say water, carbon dioxide, and sodium bicarbonate, or one or the other, what are called mineral salts. Okay. And what these salts do, so I said it adds some flavor, but at another level of granularity, what it does is to add carbon dioxide to water actually changes the pH balance of the water. It makes it a little bit more acidic, which makes it both harsher to the taste and a little bit harsher on our tummies. Okay. So adding those salts, which are alkali, it rebalances the water. So that's at a level more granular of what it does. But basically, club soda is imitation sparkling mineral water. Yeah. And then the third category, seltzer, is simplest and cheapest of all. It's just water plus carbon dioxide. So there's no mineral salts. It's just those two ingredients. So it will be a bit more acidic. Hey. Some claim that it's a better backdrop for mixers. I can't.
So technically, LaCroix and SodaStream are neither sparkling water nor club soda.
So if I recall, last time I looked at a LaCroix from my field research, I call it field research, or my rigorous field work like an archaeologist in the supermarket. Yeah. I don't think that LaCroix has any of those mineral salts.
Yeah, because I think it's a seltzer.
I think it's a flavored seltzer. Exactly. Yeah. I see. So you're right. So that would support the idea that a seltzer is the best if you're going to flavor something, because then you don't need the salts. Yeah. because all that becomes moot, perhaps, if you're
Yeah.
adding all these other flavors. Or maybe the argument is that you want a more neutral backdrop. I don't know. I mean, I'd say it's all pretty neutral. I can't claim that I have some sophisticated palate that can really tell the difference in a strong sense. But,
Yeah.
But basically, the short answer: if you're not using it as a mixer, try and get the good stuff. Get Perrier, get San Pellegrino, or whatever. But club soda is totally fine.
I always order club soda on planes. They
Yeah.
never have sparkling water, even though I didn't know what the distinction was before this. I want to think, okay, actually,
Okay, yeah.
maybe I can segue from how we first met over 10 years ago at a philosophy summer school in Italy.
That's right.
Where we were drinking a lot of sparkling water.
That's
Remember,
true.
it's frizzante in
Yes.
Italian?
Yeah, of course. It was great.
Every time
Very
I go to
refreshing.
Europe, all I'm drinking is sparkling water.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I love about Italy is that they have lightly sparkling water.
Yeah, you're right.
So good.
You're right. The
So
bubbles seem smaller.
they
And there's
definitely
fewer
are.
of them.
And
yeah.
they're easier on the stomach.
Yes, more delicate.
Yes. Okay. So the reason that I mentioned
Yeah.
this is because we have alluded to your philosophical background, and I want to end by asking you about this. So. When we first met, we were both grad students in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
We became friends that summer, along with lots of other wonderful people, some
Yes.
of whom are still in philosophy, some of whom are not. And then you detoured from your path as a philosophy PhD student and decided to become a full-time writer.
Yes.
And so tell us about that trajectory, because I think it's also really helpful for people on our channel who might be interested in studying philosophy but aren't sure what you can do with a degree in philosophy other than become a professor like me. How do you feel... just tell us a little bit about both the career trajectory and sort of how you came to where you are now. And also, I feel like it's very clear how your book, even though it's a work of humor, is very philosophical. We've been talking about that, but also about how your philosophical training has shaped what you do now. And also whether there are any bad habits you've had to unlearn that you got from philosophy.
So many good
I know,
questions.
sorry, I can refresh
No. Lots of questions and good ones. I mean, the trajectory. So trajectory is a flattering word. I would definitely say that when I left grad school, I didn't know what I was going to do. And it frankly took a number of years for me to find my footing. I think that in a way that was, it was scary, but it was also an adventure, right? It's like, well, I mean, I have to kind of create my own path now.
Yeah.
And
You just had a sense that you didn't want to stay on this.
Yeah, I mean, I
academic path.
I still love philosophy, and I love every moment I get to be, in any way vaguely philosophical.
Yeah.
And I still read it, but I mean, between novels, but so it took me a while to kind of figure out my footing, but I think that it was also an education in kind of finding my way towards what I wanted to do, kind of free of the structure of academia, and over the years I found myself just picking up a pen and starting to write funny humor pieces. Mm-hmm. Well, funny humor pieces is redundant, but humor pieces that may or may not be funny.
Your next book, Redundancy.
Yeah, redundant, exactly. I couldn't have predicted that necessarily, but I was really happy to find that I got some traction there and started publishing humor pieces, and it was on the basis of that then this book, I was able to pitch this book and make it happen. So it's definitely a less linear journey, and I don't know what's next, and that's part of the fun, part of the terror that haunts me in the night.
Yeah.
But I'm also excited by the freedom of it. So that was the question about the trajectory. The question about how does philosophy kind of shape what I do now?
Yeah.
I mean, naturally it's indirect, but I think that, even though the book, by many people's standards, strictly speaking, isn't a work of philosophy, I'm so glad that you've picked up on some of the philosophical aspects of it. And to me, I retain a conceptual bent in anything that I do. Humor is probably at the far end of the conceptual. It is very conceptual.
Yeah.
Within the realm of fiction, you're thinking in terms of premises, setups, and punchlines. It gets very abstract.
A lot of comedians and comedy writers I know in Los Angeles have a philosophy background.
Yeah, exactly. It's not, it relates to other forms of fiction, but I also think it relates to kind of, more abstract ways of engaging with language. And then language, I think, just remains a big common denominator for me. Like in grad school and even in undergrad, I mean, philosophy of language was a big branch of what I studied.
Totally.
And my area of interest. I didn't get to the dissertation phase, so I don't know I like to think that it would have been in philosophy of language, but I didn't get quite to that level of certainty yet. But it was huge in what I did and across the continental analytic divide. So, really loved Wittgenstein and the ordinary language philosophers, but also loved kind of a lot of patches of Heidegger and Derrida's early stuff where they're really getting weird and interesting with words. And I think that I think about that stuff all the time. I love it. And I think that future projects, whatever it is, I will be bringing that with me.
Great.
Yeah. Oh, and bad habits.
Yeah, bad habits.
Bad habits. I mean, overthinking everything. Yeah.
You know the name of this channel,
I was like, as I said that, overthinking, but underthinking the possibilities for wordplay. But overthinking everything and, knowing when to stop, I think is, but aren't we all struggling with that? But it's also a joy.
Yeah. Well, Eli, thank you so much for joining
pleasure.
me. It's been a real delight. I think Dictionary of Fine Distinctions is such a fun book. Like you said, it has these great illustrations. So you can check this out wherever you get your books. Also, your humor writing in McSweeney's, The New Yorker, and elsewhere.
Yes.
And thank you so much again. We hope you enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.